Juanita never expected her day to take such a drastic turn. In April of 2016, Juanita woke up and went straight to her daughter Elizabeth's room. She'd been out with some friends the night before, and she was expecting to see a slightly hungover, maybe mildly irritated Elizabeth poking her head out from under the sheets. Well, when she opened the door, the bed was made. Everything was tidy. Juanita was pleasantly surprised. Maybe Elizabeth had woken up early and went downstairs to start her day. After all, she was a single mom of 4 and she hated being late anywhere. So down the stairs Juanita went, but what stopped her dead in her tracks was the silence. Elizabeth wasn't in the kitchen either. So where was she? She searched from room to room. She might as well have turned the house upside down to find Elizabeth, but she wasn't there. As she combed through every inch of the house, even checking all the closets, she was finally forced to admit something. Elizabeth wasn't here. And just from the clean and tidy state of her bedroom, Juanita was met with a haunting realization. Elizabeth likely never made it home. Welcome to True Crime Stories. If you're new here, I'm your host, Ty Knotts, and I post new true crime documentaries every single week. So if you're interested in classic true crime without a bunch of AI nonsense, then you've come to the right place. So be sure to hit that subscribe button to keep up to date with all of my future cases. It was April 15th of 2016. Elizabeth had made plans with some of her friends from work. They were going out for happy hour that afternoon. The girls were going to have some drinks and chat about their lives, and it was long overdue for Elizabeth. She was in dire need of a girls' night out. I mean, sure, she loved her family and her kids, but in between work, being separated from her husband, and taking care of the kids, Elizabeth had very little time for herself, so this plan was just perfect. So after work, Elizabeth and her friends met up at a local bar, and they had a lot of fun catching up over drinks and food. Elizabeth's friends claimed that she was very happy and nothing pointed towards the fact that she was scared or on edge that night. If anything, she was elated and having a proper good time. But the thing is, all good times must come to an end. And nothing could have prepared anyone to hear that just hours later, that very Elizabeth, who'd been seen with a smile on her face and warmth in her heart, would be found murdered. It was a bolt out of the blue for Elizabeth's friends and family, who never thought that they could lose such a striking and warm person like that. But that is exactly what happened. And when Elizabeth lost her life, it was as if nothing was the same anymore. Up to this point, Elizabeth Arellano had lived her whole life in Fort Worth, Texas. Ever since she was young, she had a very kind heart and was part of a loving family, and she was very close with her sisters, Jo, Kelly, and Ale. Elizabeth, even after her parents' divorce, was very close to both of them. She was defined as the glue of her family, always keeping everyone together. She was also the type of person who always kept in touch with her family, knowing everywhere everyone was going and offering her own whereabouts whenever she spoke to someone. In essence, she was an open book. She was the sibling who would always ask anyone and everyone where they were, why they hadn't texted her, and she kept tabs on everyone and all that. Some people saw her as a bit of a busybody, but that couldn't be further from the truth. She just wanted to keep tabs on the people that she cared about. On top of that, Elizabeth was also a regular churchgoer. She was a devout Christian, and she believed that kindness, selflessness, and sincerity would get a person anywhere. And for the most part, she was right. But this sentiment really puts into perspective the type of person that she was: caring, patient, and all-around gentle-hearted. Elizabeth was very much a people person. But more than anything else in the world, she wanted to start a family of her own. She dreamed of meeting that special someone, settling down together and starting life together. Well, it wasn't long until she crossed paths with someone in high school. And little did she know, her dreams were about to become reality. Elizabeth met Rudy Arellano when they were still students at Diamond Hill Jarvis High School. Even though we don't really know the specifics, what we do know is that they were basically high school sweethearts who would end up being together for about 13 years. Elizabeth and Rudy went on to graduate from high school, but their relationship was stronger than ever. The two eventually got married, and then the family of 2 grew to 6, with the addition of 4 kids, 3 sons and a daughter. The 2 then moved to a house in Fort Worth where they settled down. But as with any family, things were not always perfect. Now, we don't know anything about what led to this sudden change of pace, but all of a sudden, Elizabeth announced to her family that she was considering getting a divorce from Rudy. This news took everyone by surprise. The thing is, Elizabeth never jumped into a decision like this without thinking it through long and hard. She spent a lot of her time dwelling on things, thinking things over. It was sort of a compulsion. But this was something different. Something had shifted in Elizabeth, and now she wanted out. She knew that being a single parent was going to be hard, especially when there are 4 children involved. But everyone claims that if Elizabeth came to this decision, it must have been something she had thought about for a long time. So with the decision made, Rudy and Elizabeth separated. Elizabeth had moved out of the Arellano home with her kids and moved back into her parents' house, which was still in Fort Worth. Now, according to Rudy, the pair had just been separated, but Elizabeth had other plans. She wanted to full-on divorce Rudy. She made up her mind and she was going to file for divorce in the coming days. It had only been a week since Elizabeth had walked out of her husband's home and moved into her parents' house. And even though she might have been sad about this decision too, she was happy on the outside and was living her life and working every day. I mean, divorce is never an easy option. Lives change completely forever. People you've spent years with can turn into strangers. And it's a really weird dynamic shift, especially when there are kids involved. So anyone going through this painful patch of life is going to feel all these emotions. But for Elizabeth, from the outside looking in, nothing changed at all. It was almost weird. Friends and colleagues remembered Elizabeth being her usual self, in very high spirits. She was making plans with her friends at work, she was home laughing away with her parents and siblings, and she was spending all of her time with her 4 kids, who felt like literal pieces of her heart. She was also as blissful as she had ever been. But for Elizabeth, this bliss was about to end in the worst way possible. This brings us back to that fateful day at the bar, April 15th of 2016. Elizabeth met up with her friends that day for drinks during happy hour, and they stuck around at the bar for several hours, sharing a meal and catching up on what had been going on in their lives over the last few months. Well, before they knew it, happy hour was up, and Elizabeth and her friends parted ways. Now, I'm assuming Elizabeth had drunk enough to the point where she was probably feeling a bit light, but not so much that she was unable to drive or completely incoherent. Again, this was just the type of person Elizabeth was. If she knew she was going to have enough to drink to have a designated driver, then she would have set that up beforehand. But she didn't plan to get blackout drunk, especially on a weekday. She just had a few light drinks, shared some laughs, nothing more. But still, Elizabeth's friends told her to call them as soon as she reached home. It was for their own peace of mind, if anything, and Elizabeth agreed. She made the drive home, and once she was outside her parents' house in her car, she called her friend and told her that she'd arrived home safely. She was technically home, just outside of her front door. All she had to do was disconnect the call, gather her things, and head inside. But the chilling thing is, even though she was mere feet away from her front door, Elizabeth never made it inside. What's truly haunting is that her friend was blissfully unaware of the fact that after this phone call, she'd become the last person to ever speak with Elizabeth. Well, just seconds after hanging up the phone, Elizabeth unbuckled her seatbelt, opened her car door, and stepped out. But what happened next would become a mystery that would very quickly end in utter tragedy. A few hours had gone by at this point, so it was the morning of April 16th. Elizabeth's mom, Juanita, woke up and went to wake up Elizabeth too. But imagine her surprise and shock when she came across Elizabeth's empty bedroom. This was unlike her. Juanita searched the entire house for Elizabeth, but she was nowhere to be found. And that was when Juanita looked outside the window facing the front door, and what she saw made her take off for that door. Elizabeth's car was outside, but there was no one in it. The keys were in the ignition. Elizabeth's purse and cell phone were inside the car, but again, no sign of Elizabeth. Now, she wasn't one to leave her car abandoned like that, and who would? So why was the car unattended and left like Elizabeth had just wandered off somewhere? Juanita knew deep in her heart something was wrong, and that was when she called the Fort Worth Police Department and reported her 28-year-old daughter missing. The police arrived at Elizabeth's parents' house shortly after the missing person report was filed, and it was really strange. How could Elizabeth not make it home when she was literally just steps away from her door? So for now, the police could do nothing but search for Elizabeth and hopefully find her unharmed. Elizabeth didn't have any known enemies. No one would want to abduct her or take revenge on her. So it was very confusing for the police. Nevertheless, they needed to find answers so that they could bring Elizabeth back home. But what the investigators on the scene didn't know was that someone else in the area had just found something. But they could have never known that what they just found would solve Elizabeth's missing person case. It turns out someone had placed a 911 call a couple hours after midnight. This was also the specific time that it was presumed that Elizabeth had gone missing. The call was made by a fisherman at the Loop 820 bridge overlooking Lake Worth. This fisherman was out doing some late night fishing. And now, when I say late night fishing, I mean it. This guy was literally just trolling around the lake at midnight like it was just another Tuesday. And for him, I guess it was, until he came across something. This poor fisherman's peaceful night was ripped away from him when he heard a terrifying, ear-piercing scream before a distinct splash or drop into the lake. Since it was nighttime and dark, the fisherman couldn't see who was on the edge of the water or what had even just happened. But what he could manage to make out was the figure, plummeting into the lake, had something tied to its neck. It was plummeting from a pretty decent height, right off of a ledge. The object that was attached to that plummeting figure wasn't small like a brick or anything. It was huge, like a boulder or a cinder block, which was actually the only reason why it was visible in the dark. Everything other than this object just kind of faded into the night, and the fisherman couldn't really tell what was what. Well, the guy immediately called 911 because he knew time was of the essence. The best he could tell, the object that had fallen off that ledge was most likely a person. I mean, hearing a scream right before seeing a large object fall into the water, one could only assume. But he knew that there was a good chance that if this was a person, they may still be alive. Well, as he waited for the police to arrive, he tried his best to see to the top of the bridge. But since it was dark and there wasn't much visibility, the man really couldn't tell his head from a hole in the ground. Before long, emergency services, divers, as well as firefighters made their way to the bridge, and they managed to pull the person out of the water, but it was too late for them. The person had already lost their life. Judging by the screams heard by the fisherman, the person sounded like a woman. Sure enough, it was a woman's body. She was wearing maroon medical scrubs. The same scrubs Elizabeth wore to work every single day. As police retrieved the body from the lake, they realized that this person had something tied around their neck. It was a 119-pound concrete boulder attached with a rope, almost the same weight as the woman herself. The boulder was unique because it looked like it had been used as part of a fence in the past. You know how when you put up a wooden fence or something, you dig a hole and pour concrete around the post? Well, this so-called boulder appeared to have come from something like that. Within a matter of hours, after the body was sent for examination and identification, it sadly came back as 28-year-old Elizabeth Arellano. Elizabeth, who'd just been out with friends hours prior, was now gone, and the cause of her death was obviously determined to have been drowning. Now, even though we know that Elizabeth's body had been found, her family didn't know it yet, and neither did the investigators who had just responded to her missing person report. So, as soon as Elizabeth was reported missing, the police wanted to investigate the people closest to the missing woman. Maybe there was someone who knew where Elizabeth went, or someone else was with her, and her family was worrying about nothing. Well, at first, police thought that maybe Elizabeth was just having a bender somewhere else. They thought that the busy mom just needed a break and decided to disappear off the radar for a bit. But her family was quick to shut down all of these theories. Yes, Elizabeth knew that her life was going to get tough, especially after the divorce, when she would have to work and look after her kids on her own. But it wasn't like her to just leave everything at the drop of a hat. Elizabeth was a planner. If she wanted to go somewhere, she'd make sure to tell her families and settle matters with her kids to ensure that everything would go smoothly. It wasn't like Elizabeth to just randomly disappear from the face of the earth. So the police decided to look into her closest friends first. Everyone said the same thing. Elizabeth was happy and her usual self during happy hour at the bar. No one was bothered by her, at least that they knew of, and she certainly wasn't talking about leaving everything behind for some kind of breather. This left the police with no answers. Also, when they looked at Elizabeth's car, they had this very weird feeling. The keys were still in the ignition, and this could only mean one of two things. Either Elizabeth was in such a hurry that she genuinely forgot to pull her keys out of the ignition, or maybe she was forced out of her car. Her belongings, such as her wallet and purse, were in the car too, so Elizabeth wouldn't have left without her wallet and keys, right? So unless she was forced out of the car and had no choice, there was no reason for Elizabeth to desert her car like that. Well, the police also asked neighbors around Elizabeth's family home. No one heard any screams or shouting in the middle of the night, and it was all just so bizarre. Well, with limited information and success, the police got to know about Elizabeth's personal life, and that was when their ears perked up. They heard of Elizabeth's failing marriage and her recent separation from her husband, so the police had no choice but to question that husband. They weren't looking at him as a suspect, per se. They just wanted to ask him some questions. Maybe Elizabeth told her husband where she went, and he knew where she'd be at this specific moment. The police believed that Elizabeth's husband would have some kind of answers that would make this case somewhat easier to solve, so that was where they headed. They went to the house Elizabeth shared with her 36-year-old husband, Rudy Arellano. When Rudy opened the door for the police and investigators told him why they were there, the reaction was something police didn't expect. Rudy didn't really seem concerned about his missing wife. I mean, sure, they might have been separated, but she'd made it clear she wanted a divorce, so apparently he'd already started trying to move on. But still, Elizabeth was Rudy's wife and the mother of his children. The two had known each other for 13 years. Elizabeth was Rudy's partner in crime, for lack of a better word, for such a long time. Separated or not, if a person's wife goes missing without telling anyone, leaving their kids behind, a sane person would be alarmed and worried. But the police were slightly taken aback by Rudy's reaction to his estranged wife's disappearance. Well, the police pocketed this information for now, and they started hitting Rudy with the usual questions. When was the last time he'd seen Elizabeth? Did Elizabeth talk to Rudy before she disappeared? All the usual stuff. Well, Rudy told the police that the last time he had seen Elizabeth was 2 days before her disappearance, and the last time he talked to her on the phone was sometime before her disappearance at about 2 a.m. See, Rudy told the police that he was asleep at home when he got a call from Elizabeth, saying that she'd arrived at home and that she was going to bring the kids to meet him soon. The police then went on to ask what Rudy did on the day when Elizabeth disappeared. And from the looks of it, Rudy had a pretty solid alibi. He told the police that he was with a friend helping him tint his windows, and it took him a long time to get that done. He claimed that it was around midnight when he finally came home and he was super tired. He immediately went to bed and didn't go anywhere else until 7:30 a.m. the next day. Now, if you remember, Elizabeth was due to bring the kids to meet Rudy, and he waited and waited for Elizabeth and the kids to arrive, but she never did. That was when Rudy assumed that Elizabeth must have changed her plans, so he just moved on with his day. He didn't think much of Elizabeth's absence at the time. The two were trying to put some distance between themselves anyway, so it really didn't seem all that weird. But even now, when the police were standing in front of his door, Rudy just wasn't bothered by his wife's disappearance at all. He seemed very calm, very composed, and especially for someone whose wife was missing for hours at this point. Now, people react differently in different situations. There's no manual that tells people how to react in uncomfortable or sudden situations. And maybe Rudy's situation was the same too. Maybe he was being logical and trying his best not to lose it. Maybe internally, he was just a second away from losing his mind, but he had to stay level-headed for the police. So the detectives left Rudy's house with even more questions than ever. But now, they knew that they had to look into other things. If people close to Elizabeth didn't know where she was, then the police would have to pull out the big guns and trace Elizabeth's movements using cell phone mapping and location data. So that's exactly what they did. While the police were looking into Elizabeth's phone records, that was when they got the fateful news. A body had been found in Lake Worth, and since Elizabeth had been missing for a few hours, the investigators had a pretty bad feeling about it. They knew that Elizabeth was wearing maroon scrubs at the time of her disappearance, and when they heard what the woman in the lake was wearing, it was like everything stopped. The investigators on Elizabeth's case finally knew whose body was found in that lake, and it was Elizabeth Arellano. The missing person investigation had turned into something else entirely, and now the police had two tasks on their hands. First, they had to figure out how Elizabeth lost her life, and second, they had to break this terrible news to her family. When Elizabeth's parents and sisters got that very devastating call from the police, they went through a roller coaster of emotions. Disbelief, anger, sadness, confusion, everything came over them. This news is heartbreaking for anyone, but for it to come upon them so suddenly, without any warning or lead-up, it was just tragic through and through. Now initially, it was assumed that Elizabeth had taken her own life. I mean, it was believable to some extent, but that wouldn't be the case, especially when someone came forward and completely changed the course of the investigation. and now the police knew that there was foul play involved. When the police took the rope and the concrete rock in as evidence and showed them to Elizabeth's family, someone immediately recognized the two items, and it was none other than Elizabeth's oldest son, who was only 14 when he lost his mom in the most tragic way possible. Elizabeth's son remembered this rope because he used to play with it when the family lived together at Rudy's house, the Arellano family home. The concrete boulder, or rock, or whatever you want to call it, was from Rudy's own backyard. As I mentioned a moment ago, the concrete looked like it had been used for some sort of fencing, and Elizabeth's son confirmed that it was indeed part of an old fence. Now, even if we believe for 1 second that Elizabeth wanted to end it all, why would she go to Rudy's house of all places to retrieve this specific rope and rock? If she wanted to take matters into her own hands and needed a rope and a heavy boulder, or she could have found it anywhere. No one really believed that Elizabeth would take such a drastic step, especially when there was nothing to indicate that she was struggling mentally or wasn't coping well. To top this off, that boulder was over 100 pounds. Even if Elizabeth wanted to end her own life in some strange way, chances are it wouldn't have been possible because she weighed almost the same as this boulder. All of this information was like a bombshell moment for the police. Everything was falling into place perfectly. Almost too perfectly. At this point in the investigation, the police were already kind of suspicious of Elizabeth's estranged husband, mainly because he didn't have a great alibi. Sure, he claimed he was with a friend that night that Elizabeth went missing, but just one single friend's word wasn't much for a solid alibi. He could have easily just been lying, both of them. So now, it was time to get elbow deep into the investigation and figure out what Rudy was really up to on the night of April 15th. So the police started with good old phone records, and within no time, they found cracks in Rudy's story. The day when Elizabeth went out with her friends, Rudy's phone records showed that he tried calling and texting Elizabeth multiple times. He wanted to know when she was getting off work and where she was going. But why? The two were in the midst of a divorce. It was 100% not any of his business what Elizabeth was up to. Next, cell phone location mapping showed Rudy at Elizabeth's workplace right before she left with her friends from the bar, which sounds really creepy in hindsight. Worse yet, at around 3 a.m. on the night Elizabeth disappeared, Rudy's phone location showed that he was actually near her parents' house, even though he clearly said he was home since midnight and didn't go anywhere else until 7:30 the next morning. Obviously, he was lying, and the police were very quickly catching up to him. So things were falling into place, and the police were sure that the seemingly grieving husband wasn't such a saint. To add to that suspicion, as if not being concerned for his missing wife wasn't enough, Rudy wasn't the least bit bothered about the investigation or how it was going. In fact, police realized that he hadn't really even bothered to check in with them regarding the investigation at all. He just straight up did not care one bit. Whereas everyone else, including Elizabeth's stepdad, siblings, parents, and her own children, were terrified of the possibilities going through their heads, and they were hounding the police for answers. Well, finally, the police also got a search warrant for Rudy's home. And when they went into the backyard, sure enough, they found a fence that was torn apart, and one concrete anchor was missing. The police could safely assume that the missing anchor was the one found with Elizabeth's body. There were other similar concrete boulders by the fence in the backyard too, and when the police checked Rudy's car, they found broken pieces of concrete in the bed of his truck. This was about as clean-cut as a crime scene could possibly be. Very clearly, it looked like Rudy had grabbed the concrete chunk, tied it to Elizabeth, tossed her in the concrete in the bed of his truck, and then driven to the lake. It felt so obvious. But to be 100% sure, the police tested the samples of concrete found in Rudy's truck, as well as the concrete found with Elizabeth's body. And wouldn't you know it, they were the exact same. The boulder used to weigh down Elizabeth was taken from none other than Rudy's own home. The police finally had a considerable pile of evidence against Rudy, and now all that was left to do was arrest him and hopefully find some answers that would lead to solving Elizabeth's very confusing and sudden murder. Soon enough, 36-year-old Rudy Arellano was arrested on suspicion of murdering his wife on April 26, 2016, just 10 days after Elizabeth's body was found in Lake Worth. He was held on a $500,000 bond in Mansfield City Jail, and he'd be officially charged with murder just a short while later. Following Rudy's arrest, the police were able to piece together what might have happened to Elizabeth when she was outside her parents' house on the night of April 15th. Phone records were of huge help when it came to figuring out who was where and when. It was thanks to these phone records that the police were able to realize that Rudy was truly, without a doubt, lying. Sure, he wasn't acting like a worried husband to begin with, but the police couldn't just arrest him because he wasn't worried about his missing wife. But now they had solid proof. He was not at home when he claimed to be. If you remember, when the police first talked to Rudy after Elizabeth was reported missing, he said he was with a friend helping to tint his windows, and then came back home in the evening and didn't go anywhere until 7:30 the next day. Well, the phone records had something entirely different to say. See, Rudy's phone records showed that he was outside Elizabeth's workplace when she was getting done with work. He was in the area where Elizabeth worked for hours. This was really weird for the police, as well as everyone else. Why was Rudy following his estranged wife to work? How did he know she'd be getting off of work soon? Now, I'm sure Rudy had some idea about Elizabeth's schedule, because the two lived together for over a decade, but still, Rudy being at Elizabeth's workplace is weird, and to piece together what happened afterward, it left everyone feeling unsettled. But there's more. Rudy didn't stop at Elizabeth's workplace. If you remember, phone records also showed he was in the same area where Elizabeth's parents lived right before Elizabeth pulled up in the driveway after her night out with friends. Rudy was essentially at Elizabeth's parents' house in the middle of the night, just sitting there, because her parents never mentioned seeing him that evening. He must have just been lurking there for who knows how long. There was literally no reason for him to follow her, and that too at such an odd time. But if you thought Rudy was done, well, there's still a lot to unpack from those phone records. Rudy's, as well as Elizabeth's phone records, showed that Rudy was blowing up Elizabeth's phone at work. Remember, Rudy kept asking Elizabeth when she was going to be free from work and if he could meet up with her. The police thought this was Rudy looking for the perfect chance to strike. As far as anyone knows, Elizabeth never answered any of Rudy's calls or replied to his texts, so that's likely when he just showed up to watch and wait. Well, come to find out, in the days leading up to Elizabeth going missing, she'd supposedly informed Rudy that she'd be staying in a hotel for the foreseeable future. Now, Rudy obviously didn't want his estranged wife and kid to be setting up shop in some ratty motel, so he insisted that she stay at his house for the time being, but obviously she refused. Elizabeth was adamant about getting a divorce and starting her life fresh, and this offer was clearly a ploy to try to win Elizabeth back, and she wasn't about to give in. Regardless of all this though, it was clear that Rudy was caught in lie after lie. At the end of his made-up stories, he even claimed that he was home alone, asleep, when Elizabeth called him at 2 a.m. to talk about bringing the kids over. But this too was proven to be false when phone records proved no such call was ever made, nor was Rudy even at home at this hour. But outside of the phone records, police were about to uncover something truly harrowing. See, near Elizabeth's home, several CCTV cameras had just been installed. Call it coincidence or luck, but these newly installed cameras caught something that led to answers in this very confusing case. See, at around 2:41 a.m. on April 16th, Elizabeth's car was seen pulling up at her family's home. But moments later, that car drove away for unknown reasons. Sometime later, at around 3 a.m., a white Dodge Ram pickup truck was seen driving north from Elizabeth's parents' house, the same pickup truck that Rudy owned. Same color, model, everything. This was another incriminating piece of evidence found near Elizabeth's home. The footage was grainy, so the license plate couldn't be made out, at least not at the time. But the truck was en route to the Loop 820 bridge, the same bridge where Elizabeth's body was found. To confirm this, the police went through hours of footage in the same area, and minutes later that same white pickup truck was seen on North Main Street just south of the bridge where Elizabeth fell, or was pushed, to her death. If that wasn't enough, it turned out that Rudy was having the time of his life after Elizabeth tragically lost hers. A neighbor remembered seeing Rudy sitting on the front porch, drinking beer and blasting music. He didn't look like he'd just lost his wife of 13 years and the mother of his children. If anything, he seemed happy, blissful even. Investigators were still having a hard time, though, trying to get Rudy to open up about what had happened to his wife. He still tried to deny everything, even though evidence pinned him at the crime scene. Well, the investigators had other tricks up their sleeves. They were confident that Rudy would be found guilty by a jury, thanks to the evidence they had on him. And if he were found guilty, then Rudy would likely be given the death penalty. Well, This was what made Rudy snap back into his senses, and the coward finally surrendered in front of investigators and agreed to a plea deal. He would be charged with murder, but he wouldn't get the death penalty if he pleaded guilty. It seems like Rudy's own life was precious to him, but his wife's wasn't, which is why he was so quick to accept that plea deal. It took 3 years for this back and forth to finally reach an end, and on January 30th, 2019, Rudy finally pleaded guilty to the charges against him, even though he didn't exactly explain or go into detail about what he had done to Elizabeth. But the investigators tried to piece together what might have happened, and the specifics of this crime, they were utterly unreal, and will probably make you want to vomit. It's believed that Rudy followed Elizabeth around all day. He tried calling her, texting her, but Elizabeth wasn't paying him any attention. We don't know why Rudy was so adamant about reaching out to Elizabeth. The two were separated, and there was nothing to talk about. This is exactly what makes this case so haunting and confusing. We will never know why Rudy attacked Elizabeth so ruthlessly and callously. But it's believed that after Elizabeth parted ways with her friends and went home, Rudy followed in his white pickup truck. When Elizabeth reached her front door and texted her friends that she'd made it home, that was probably when Rudy saw his golden chance. Elizabeth was momentarily distracted, and that was when Rudy struck. He approached Elizabeth, hauled her out of her own car, and the two drove away in his truck. The CCTV footage showed the truck driving from Elizabeth's parents' home, and that is so chilling. Elizabeth was surely in the car in this footage, either fighting with Rudy or scared to the bone. Afterward, it's believed that Rudy subdued Elizabeth and tied the rope and heavy boulder around her neck. Then he made his way over to the Lake Worth Bridge and pushed the concrete boulder off, which had been tied to her neck, so Elizabeth slipped off the edge along with it. The boulder prevented Elizabeth from resurfacing, and she was likely struggling immensely until she tragically lost her life. Another very chilling assumption made by the police is that the boulder was tied to Elizabeth's body specifically so that she would sink into the lake bed, never to be found. Luckily, that wasn't the case, because God bless that fisherman. He helped recover Elizabeth's body and get this case closed quickly. If not for that fisherman, there's a good chance Elizabeth may never have been found. It is so terrifying to think that Elizabeth was still alive when she was ripped almost 40 feet into the water. If you remember, the fisherman heard a woman's screams just before he saw her falling. So you have to wonder, what would have been Elizabeth's final thoughts when she saw her own husband, the father of her children, tossing her into a lake like skipping stones on a pond? The man literally didn't have a care in the world. He just had a chip on his shoulder and was determined to take out his anger on the woman he'd claimed to love and cherish for the last 13 years. This was not an accident, as police initially suspected. Rudy deliberately kidnapped Elizabeth and then made sure to weigh her down so that she couldn't save herself. Rudy wanted Elizabeth gone, but for what reason? Well, Rudy only knows, and he's not talking. A few days after Rudy's guilty plea, he was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. But one thing that a lot of people still struggle to understand is why. Why did Rudy go to such lengths? Why did he choose such a heinous and violent way of murdering his wife? What was the reason? What made Rudy go off the rails and resort to murder? Well, this is something we'll likely never know. Rudy has been very tight-lipped about why he murdered his wife, and honestly, everyone is just left feeling shocked. Not just by learning that it was Rudy, Elizabeth's own husband, who killed her, but also at the fact that there wasn't any sign or inkling. Even Elizabeth's own family doesn't know what happened behind closed doors. They don't know whether it was a domestic abuse situation, infidelity, or what caused the two to even separate. It's as much of a mystery to them as it is to us. In most cases in which one spouse is the victim to the other, well, there's usually an underlying reason why the events escalate to cold and calculated murder. Sometimes it's the pressure of getting a divorce, paying child support and alimony, something. But in Elizabeth's case, the reason is tucked away out of sight under a thick blanket of speculation. Maybe Rudy couldn't digest the fact that Elizabeth was able to move on so easily while he couldn't, and he thought that the best way to teach Elizabeth a lesson for simply living her life was to murder her and leave their children motherless and fatherless. Because again, in the end, the only people who suffered were Elizabeth's family and her kids. These poor children lost their mom, and their dad was the reason why everything came crashing down. Elizabeth was a wonderful mother and person in general from the sounds of it, but that didn't stop a vengeful and proud monster from stealing her life away from her and leaving their children as orphans. Rudy didn't think or regret his decision even once. He pushed Elizabeth off the edge and into the river like she was a roadblock, and everything ended in tragedy. Whether he did it out of spite, jealousy, rage, greed for money because of the divorce, not wanting to pay spousal support or child support, we'll never know. But it is gut-wrenching that Elizabeth had to lose her life like that, suffering until her last breath. Following the sentencing, Elizabeth's family gave their very emotional, moving, and heart-wrenching victim impact statements. Elizabeth's sisters, Ale and Jo, who were extremely close to one another, were in tears on the stand, but they were brave enough to look Rudy in the eye and try their best to make him feel their pain. They blamed Rudy for ruining his own children's lives by robbing them of their mom, her love, and security. Elizabeth's sisters broke down when they explained that Elizabeth's kids cry every single night because they miss their mom. They don't have to know about the dark and twisted stuff that led to their mom's passing. They're just kids, and they just want their mom back. It is so far beyond devastating that these kids are forced to deal with something like this, knowing good and well they'll never see their mom again, and it's their dad's fault. Elizabeth's stepdad, Fidel, also took the stand, and his statement was also focused mainly on Elizabeth's children. But at the end of his words, Fidel looked Rudy in the eye and said what we've all likely been thinking. I hope you rot in hell. Rudy, being the ultimate monster that he is, didn't even bat an eye during the statements. He was completely emotionless and stoic, with his hands behind his back and his eyes completely void. He didn't have an ounce of guilt on his face, and that made everyone that much more angry. What hurts Elizabeth's family the most is that during Elizabeth's disappearance, Rudy was right there by their side, posting pictures of his wife and pleading with everyone for information on Elizabeth to come forward, when he was the one who was making the family go through all this all along. Turns out he was just going through the motions trying to avoid suspicion, but in the end, well, the police were pretty much on to him the whole time. Rudy's double-faced personality essentially double-crossed the family in the worst possible way. The only time Rudy ever showed any emotion was at Elizabeth's burial, where he was putting on an act of being the devastated and grief-stricken widower, and he stood by Jo and Ale, pretending to sob the whole while. Elizabeth was a mom, sister, daughter, and aunt, and she was the type of person anyone would have loved to get to know. She was an amazing mom, trying everything in her power to give her kids a good and comfortable life. But in the end, her own life was stolen from her. And that too, by someone that used to be her life partner and best friend. Thank you guys for tuning in to another episode of True Crime Stories. I wanted to give a special thank you to a couple channel members, including C and Louisa O'Halloran. If you also want to become a member of the channel, you'll gain access to new videos sometimes days or weeks before they're uploaded to the public. And it's a great way to support the channel and help out. And I really appreciate all of you guys that have decided to do that. If you want to join, you can click that big join button below the video or find a link down in the description. And don't forget, True Crime Stories t-shirts are also now available. You can grab one of those from a link down in the description as well. But as always, if you enjoyed this video, check out this other interesting case I covered. And don't forget to subscribe. It's totally free. It just keeps you up to date with all my future videos. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.